Good afternoon, folks. This is Joe Papano from Fiberlink Communications. I want to welcome you to another More Series webinar. Today we have a very special guest speaker, Andrew Borg, who is a Senior Research Analyst and Practice Lead in Wireless and Mobility at the Aberdeen Group. And Andrew is going to be presenting what I think is some of the most informative and actionable information and research on mobility that I've seen in quite a while. So I think everyone who's attending today is going to learn quite a bit, not just about what everyone out there in the industry is doing in terms of best in class and not best in class, but also some very actionable information for any company, regardless of where they land in the continuum of best practices to help make them better. So Andrew, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm going to hand it over to you. We'll do a little bit of Q&A if we have some time after Andrew finishes up. Andrew, thanks.
Joe, thank you, and thank you for that generous introduction. Welcome all. I'd like to share with you today some of our most recent research here at Aberdeen on what we call enterprise mobility management. We'll talk about that today. I'd like to show you briefly the agenda. We're going to talk about the overview of the research study we just published last month. We're going to talk about specific challenges for the enterprise regarding mobility. We're going to talk about the capabilities that really need to be in place in order to take advantage of the power of mobility in the enterprise. And then we'll talk specifically about what we define here at Aberdeen as enterprise mobility management, or EMM, and how that's differentiated perhaps from other perspectives on enterprise mobility you may have been exposed to in the past. And lastly, we'll look at the results. What are the impact of the best practices that we're going to examine here? How does that actually benefit businesses? What is, in other words, the business value of enterprise mobility management when it's well managed? So as the overview of the study, this is, as I mentioned, published last month. Demographics for the study, we had over 250 respondents. You can see here by their job title, we had over half, that is 37% and 15% that you see there on the far right in blue, both from CEOs to directors. Over half had purchasing or decision-making authority, and that's important to us because that tells us that the survey respondents have a real business, if you will, business decision-making authority, and therefore this really counts to them. They're coming to this survey and to this study to learn and to share their best practices with peers. Also, managers at 25% shows that there's a good percentage of influencers as well. When we look at job role, if you notice here in the dark blue, information technology or IT at 34%, that is certainly the biggest sector, but what's interesting to us is it also tells us that 66% of the respondents are outside of IT. So that tells us that this topic of enterprise mobility and managing the enterprise mobile infrastructure is of concern to across the organization, not just to IT. And you can see here it matters to business development and sales, corporate management, marketing, operations, et cetera. So there's a broad interest in this topic, and it tells us that this is really timely. We look at the company size by revenue. You see there's a pretty even distribution by small, medium, and large enterprises. You can see how we break them out here by revenue. Small under 50 million, medium from 50 million to $1 billion annual US dollars, and large over $1 billion. If we look at the industry breakout, you see here that there is a large proportion in terms of the industry sector in the high-tech sector, both consulting, software, telecom, and computer equipment, but not terribly far behind. You can see we've got healthcare, medical, government, public sector, education, utilities, and financial services. So again, there is a decent spread here across industry verticals represented in the survey base. Now, what we do at Aberdeen often is we will look at what we call precursors. That is to say, what is the earlier research that we have conducted that might have pointed us in a particular direction. And here you can see we're looking at precursors from 2010. This is from a study published in May of 2010. And it was actually the first study we did on enterprise mobility management. And we see here that the sort of top of mind among what we call best-in-class organizations, which are in dark blue, those are the top 20% of industry performers as measured across multiple performance metrics. And I'll give you some more detail in just a minute about how we specifically define them, with which metrics, in other words. But just for the moment, if you'll accept at face value that the dark blue here are the top 20% of performers, we can see what was top of mind a year ago. The need for IT standards for mobile device support. The need to support more than one mobile platform. This is sort of the evolution of the market from what we used to call homogeneous or single platform support to multi-platform support. And lastly, there was this notion of ITSM, which stands for IT Service Management. So ITSM principles are being utilized. What does that mean? It means that there is a move among top performers to standardize their IT support of mobility based upon international standards, which is ITSM is part of the international standards movement around IT service management. So we can see here basically that managing the complexity, the growing complexity of the enterprise mobile infrastructure a year ago was top of mind, and that's why we decided to conduct this report. This was to take a look at, a year later, how have things changed and what is top of mind today. Now, there are several aspects to what we call our research hypothesis that I want to share with you that relates to IT strategy. So when we begin a new study, we have some assumptions we're going to test based upon the results. The first was where we were looking for signs that IT is looking to control access to all company network assets by all mobile devices and all mobile end users. So that was the first assumption. The second one was to ensure compliance to corporate standards for all mobile devices with that access. Third, to support a variety of mobile device platforms. Again, this notion of heterogeneous versus homogeneous platforms. And lastly, to control, manage, and maintain all the mobile devices remotely over the air. So these are the theorems, if you like, we were looking to either prove or disprove. Where is the market at this point in time? So some of the challenges we found, let's look at, this is what we call a longitudinal view. This is looking over 3 years of survey results, looking at the adoption of smartphone platforms over time. Now, if you pay attention to the dark blue, which is iPhone, and the orange, which is Android, you can see over that 3-year time frame a very rapid acceleration of adoption across our survey respondents. If you look at the bright pink, which is RIM's BlackBerry, the maroon there, which is Windows Mobile, and the rest, you can see that they have, in fact, suffered in terms of overall market adoption, not necessarily by numbers, but by percentage of the total. So what that's telling us is that the growth over these 3 years has been somewhat at the expense of what you might call the older generation or previous generation of smartphones, and the most modern architectures represented by iPhone and Android have been rapidly accelerating. So this is a reality that if you look from the far left in 2008 to the far right in 2010, you see by the time we get to 2010 that it's truly a multi-platform environment. We have another data point. Yes.
I'm sorry, this is Joe. I just wanted to kind of double up on one thing you said with complexity there, because what's kind of interesting is that the most manageable and secure mobile endpoints like BlackBerry and Windows Mobile are the ones declining, and it's the less easily managed ones that are the ones increasing.
That's certainly a part of the reality, Joe, and I'm glad you bring that out. I will say that the manageability, to use that term, of iPhone and Android is increasing rapidly. Being new entrants to the market, it's not that unusual to expect there to be a couple-year time frame for them to come up to the same level of capability and security that previous platforms did. Now, I'm not going to say right now that we have parity in terms of the BlackBerry Enterprise Server, for example, and mobility management for iPhone and Android, but certainly iPhone is rapidly approaching that level of manageability and security. Android is trailing a bit, but Android is also a newer platform. So I think it's a matter of time, and not that long a period of time before there is parity at that level.
Yeah, agreed.
But still well taken that at this point in time, securely managing the infrastructure is not a given, and if one was to go with a single platform solution, for example, with RIM's solution, the BlackBerry Enterprise Server, currently shipping, one would not have the ability to manage the iPhone and the Android devices through that same environment. So it really is about looking for a single environment which can securely manage all of the ecosystem, and we already described how it's becoming multi-platform. And Joe, this is another data point to just sort of underscore that. This is based on the November study that we published on enterprise-grade mobile applications, and at that time we found that that 2.9, basically on average, 3 platforms were already being supported by the respondents in aggregate. And if we look out over the next 12 months, that is through 2011, basically adding on average another platform. So by the end of the year, almost 4 platforms on average will be supported by the average respondent. So again, Joe, this notion of it being heterogeneous and that there need to be a solution for the entire mix, not just one platform, is what's really paramount.
Yes.
Now, if we look at, I just want to share this with you. This is another view on smartphones, but this is based now on the most current report. So this tells us, this is the report that we're referring to, the new report. This shows us that in terms of currently supported by IT, that is formal corporate support, clearly the RIM platform, the BlackBerry, is in the lead. But if we add to that the currently using but without formal support, you see that in fact the iOS smartphones, in other words iPhone, is almost at parity with the BlackBerry, and Android following not too far behind. Now, if we look out for the next 12 months through the end of 2011, in yellow here we see that those who are not currently using but considering for future use, if they were to move to these platforms that they intend to, you would see that the iOS smartphones are in fact at a greater level of penetration than even RIM's BlackBerry by the end of the year. I think your chart's having a little hard time, Joe, catching up from my end. I'm already on the next slide. So I think we have a little bit of a packet delivery issue here.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the other.
Folks, for those of you in the audience who are only seeing the currently using smartphones, I can just read you some of the data you're going to be seeing in a minute if WebEx is able to send it to you. But basically, if you add together the currently supported, the currently used but not formally supported, and considering for future use, now you see it just appeared here. You can see that iPhone, right? So iPhone, in fact, its adoption is expected to be greater than that of BlackBerry. Now, I want to be clear about one thing here, Joe. We're not talking about the number of devices. We're talking about the number or the percentage of responding organizations who are using these platforms for business. So the actual number or percentage of devices is another question that we looked at in the study, but in this case, we're just looking at the percentage of organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So this is both current and intended use. Now, we have some similar data around tablets, both current, intended, and both formally supported and not. And again, this is taking a little while to paint for you, but so I'll describe it to you, and hopefully by the time I finish, you'll actually see it in front of you. But in this case, we're looking at, if you take that same notion of combining, here you see it now, in the dark blue currently using with formal IT support, the light blue currently using without formal IT support, and add to that considering for future use. In terms of the iPad, you've got almost 96% of organizations expected to be using iPad for business purposes by the end of the year. But look at the growth expected for Android tablets, huge growth, approaching that of iPad for sure. And a lot of interest in the BlackBerry Playbook. Here you see over half of the respondents are considering for future use, and also some attention being paid to HP's WebOS touchpad tablet, which in fact hasn't even shipped yet, but a high level of expectation. So again, this tells us that we have a multi-platform environment for smartphones. We also are going to have a multi-platform environment for tablets. So this is the real world. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, sorry, I mean, Andrew, we see the exact same kind of thing here. I mean, customers we talk to and, you know, people we meet in the marketplace, I mean, the conversation is really around tablets right now.
Yeah, the rate of adoption on tablets is unlike anything we've seen. The corollary that I've been drawing recently is that the rate of adoption of tablets in 6 months exceeds the rate of adoption of the current generation of smartphones over 2 years. So basically, as a thumbnail, you can say it's almost 4 times the rate of adoption. And Joe, there are I think some very compelling business reasons why tablets are being adopted so rapidly, and we can talk about those in just a little minute, in a minute or two. And certainly, we can take some during Q&A. We can take some questions around that if any of you would like to discuss it. But I'd like to talk about another aspect which also impacts IT when it comes to mobility, which is the use of personal mobile devices, sometimes called employee liable or individual liable, as compared to the company procured, or sometimes called company liable. And so what this graph shows us is that almost half of organizations are saying yes to any employee-owned device. About a quarter are saying yes to only employee-owned devices from a pre-approved and pre-tested list, and just over a quarter are saying no, not at all. And we're seeing this change rapidly over time. We first noticed we sometimes call it here the invasion of employee-liable devices. We first noticed this in December of 2008 when we did a backwards look over the year, and we saw a fourfold increase in the percentage of organizations who were beginning to permit employee-liable devices from January 2008 through December 2008. We've only continued to see that grow apace. One thing I might mention, I've talked about best in class already, and I'm going to be actually defining the best in class in just a minute. But I will say that one of the things this slide does not show is that the best in class are much more likely to be in that second group, that is to say, yes from approved company list only, whereas the laggards, those who are at the bottom of the performance scale, are more likely to be in the first group, saying yes any device. And we're going to talk about the impact of those two philosophies, if you will, on both cost and risk to the organization, and why it is that we're recommending that the best-in-class approach, that is to say from approved company-tested platforms only, is the best practice here. Let's move on, and we'll return to this topic a little bit later. So now let's look at what's driving the adoption, if you will, of enterprise mobility based on this most recent study. This is what we call the pressures, top pressures. These are sometimes we describe as being the pain points, if you will, top of mind. What are the external and internal macroeconomic and microeconomic pressures driving the organization to make some adaptation, some change in terms of mobility? And here you see that the topmost strategy, 61% of all respondents agree that executive and employee demands to leverage mobility's productivity gains to the broader organization. What does that mean? It means that historically, mobility came into the organization typically through either the executive suite or through field service and field sales organizations, because that was the most immediate need and most justifiable, if you would, from a cost perspective. But what's happening now is that the productivity benefits and, if you will, operational efficiency benefits have been well documented by Aberdeen as well as many others to convince the organization that it's time to move mobility to the broader organization. In other words, not just the executive suite and the field force, but everyone in between as well. And 61% agree with that. Also, you can see here the need to become more operationally efficient. There is a connection in the mind of the survey respondents between mobility and operational efficiency, which to us shows some growing maturity in the marketplace. It's not just about a loose notion of productivity. It's about a more tangible and measurable business benefit around operational efficiency. And we think that's very interesting finding. And lastly, the increasing capabilities and complexities of the new mobile devices. So we looked at that just a minute ago with a variety of devices and platforms and vendors, software versions and applications. There's a pressure to accommodate this complexity by integrating mobility under the purview of IT using enterprise mobility management solutions, which we'll talk about in more detail. Okay, so what's the reaction? What is the strategic response, in other words, to those top pressures? You see here that the topmost strategy, by almost half, is to ensure all mobile devices with access are compliant with standards. So how does one enforce those standards? Well, we'll look in a minute how that's done, but we'll cut to the chase and say the only way to enforce corporate standards on mobility is to be able to remotely access, control, and manage those mobile devices, which is what the core capability of enterprise mobility management. Also, you can see here the need to support that heterogeneous mix, which we looked at earlier, and to standardize enterprise mobility management across the enterprise. So these are the top three strategies across all respondents in aggregate. All right, so what capabilities are needed to address these strategies? How does one, what skill sets, what processes, what technologies need to be in place in order to address those strategies or put those to work, so to speak? So the first group we looked at, we actually look at many areas, but I wanted to define for you now how we defined the best in class for this study. And this is part of the Aberdeen research methodology. Those of you who are interested to know more, please contact me by email. I'd be happy to go into much more detail about our methodology. but suffice it to say, for the purposes of today's discussion, that we look at two primary attributes when we look at respondents and do the analysis. The first is what capabilities they have in place, which we're about to look at, and the second is how they perform as a business. So how they perform as a business we call the maturity class, and what capabilities they have in place we call the PACE methodology. And again, if you want to know more about that, just contact me. But what's interesting here, I think, is when you combine the top 20% of the performers and look at what capabilities they have, you've basically defined an objective way to understand the best practices. In other words, those are the behaviors of the top performers. That's what we're going to do today, is look at what they do differently. So in this case, this is how we defined the best in class. The first attribute we looked at was what percentage of employees have secure remote mobile access to the company network. The second metric we looked at was what percentage of lost or stolen mobile devices were never recovered, lost forever. And lastly, we asked a subjective question to the respondent: how has mobility management impacted your personal experience, your speed of decision making? Has it had any impact at all? And if so, how so? And I see, Joe, that again we have a communications lag here.
Yeah.
But it will paint. So let me talk it through, and by the time I'm done, hopefully you'll see what I'm referring to. So the first metric, that was employees that have secure remote mobile access to the company network. We see here that 89% of the best-in-class employees have that secure access. Now that's well over twice that of the industry average, which, and I should have defined what I mean by these three maturity classes. The best-in-class, I did mention, was the top 20%. The industry average in gold is that, if you will, the middle 50% of the distribution curve. That would be the industry normal. And then the trailing 30% we call the laggard. So here you see that just 8% of the laggards, their employees have secure remote mobile access, whereas 89%, almost 10 times as many of the best-in-class employees have that access. If you look
That's
at
amazing.
lost or sorry, comment?
Yeah, I was saying that's amazing, the disparity.
If you look at lost or stolen mobile devices that were never recovered, 3.8% of best-in-class, 3.8% of their devices were never recovered that were lost, which looks pretty good when you compare it to the average, which is almost twice that at 7.1%, and the sort of the horrendous view of laggards who basically couldn't recover any of their lost or stolen devices. Now, Joe, this is going to be something I'm going to return to towards the end of our talk today, but even this notion of 3.8% among best-in-class is problematic, and we'll talk about why that is in just a bit. If you look here at the last, sorry, comment?
No.
Okay. If you look at the last set here around the change in your personal speed of decision-making, you can see that, again, this is a subjective or qualitative measure, but again, it's sort of consistent with the prior quantitative measures that on average, the respondents among best-in-class felt they increased their speed of decision-making by over 20%, which was significantly greater than both industry average and laggard. So a real performance differential here that's quite dramatic. Now let's look at how this impacts the capabilities that we were referring to earlier. One thing I wanted to mention just for a minute, now that we understand how best-in-class, average, and laggards are different, I wanted to revisit this topic of employee liable to see if there was a fundamentally different driver among best-in-class organizations versus all others. And when we say all others, we mean industry average and laggards combined. So here you see that the top two attributes, employees gaining additional productivity and the fact that the company is comfortable with compliance and risk issues as being the reasons why they permit employee liable, that the best-in-class organizations clearly lead there. Whereas the bottom two attributes, where as a way to reduce cost and a admission, if you will, that IT lacks proper resourcing, is much more dominant among all others, that is industry average and laggard. So we see two different drivers here. Best-in-class say increasing productivity, and we know we can manage risk, and the laggards say we've got to reduce cost, and so we're basically just letting up the floodgates, and we don't have the internal resources to support. Now, I'm going to point to this slide again a little bit later. This is another one of those key milestones here that we'll refer to, because we're seeing here that the best-in-class are less concerned about cost, whereas all others are much more cost-conscious. But the irony here, Joe, is that when we look at actually the cost that is incurred by the best-in-class, they have lowered cost, whereas those who are more concerned, that is the average and laggards, actually have higher cost. There's a certain irony there that isn't lost on me, and hopefully not lost on the rest of you, that the best-in-class must be doing something right to be lowering their cost. So let's move on and talk about process capabilities here. This is just an example. Those of you who'd like to know more about this study can get in detail from FiberLink's website, I believe, a copy of this report where you can actually get much more detail. I'm just going to give you a couple of samples here. But some process capabilities where there's some real differential. Here you can see the whole issue of security. So the first is secure authentication of mobile users and their devices. So authenticating both users and devices independently before providing corporate access. And what we mean by corporate access would be access to email, access to files, etc. You can see here the best-in-class are much more likely, if you will, to have that capability already in place, almost 80%. Having a security policy already established which incorporates the full life cycle of all compliant mobile devices. And this term life cycle I'm going to refer to on several instances. It's one of the key findings or takeaways we feel is embedded in this research, that what's essential here is not just device management, although mobile device management is essential in the core, if you will, of any enterprise mobility management strategy. If you really think about where the greatest vulnerability is to the organization, if that device is lost or stolen, is not the financial value of the device, which is going to be $400 to $500. It's the risk, if you will, of lost or stolen confidential or proprietary data, which will be far in excess of $500. So it's almost more important to consider the management of corporate data on mobile devices than it is just the device itself. Both of them are essential, don't get me wrong, but it's the full life cycle which matters, not just device management. And that's really a core takeaway I'd like you all to consider from today's walkthrough of this research. And the last one you see here is that security policy is actually enforced for enterprise data on employee-owned devices. Over half of the best-in-class have that capability already in place. So this notion of security, authentication, and compliance, absolutely consistent with what one would expect in best practices, but it's always good to see it represented, if you will, quantifiably by metrics which can be measured and compared. We look at other capabilities here. We're going to look at organizational capabilities which are relevant. Bear with me while we have a lag here. So unfortunately, you're lagging a bit, but I'm going to start reading ahead, and eventually it will fill in for you, Joe. But we're looking here at organizational capabilities, and the first capabilities we look at are access to company assets by all mobile devices is controlled by IT. Again, this notion of consolidation and centralization under IT is a key finding. Having in-house mobile help desk support for all compliant devices, and senior executive buy-in, that is C-level executive support or buy-in of the EMM initiative. These are all essential organizational capabilities of best-in-class organizations. And these can be takeaways, if you will, for all others to learn from their success. So now we're going to look at technology enablers. Here we see that there are several features here which are really essential. Remote mobile device lock and wipe, over-the-air mobile software update, being able to centrally manage those mobile devices over the air or OTA, having the capabilities for in-house developed mobile software, a self-service web portal, and an enterprise mobile software app store. You can see here that in all cases, best-in-class organizations are much more likely to have these technology enablers in place, and so we can begin to ascribe some of their performance advantage to these practices. So this brings us to what it is that the best-in-class are doing differently, and this is where we're talking now about enterprise mobility and management. And I'd like to define for you what we mean here at Aberdeen by enterprise mobility management, or EMM. There are 6 primary stages as we look at the EMM life cycle. The first is provisioning. The second is performance management, operations and support, compliance and security, expense management, and decommissioning. And you can see this is almost like, if you will, I'll just bring up this graphic. This is really an evergreen process, a continually renewing process within the organization as new devices and new platforms and new software is brought in. They need to be provisioned, performance managed, They need to be supported and operationally integrated. They need to be compliant with policy and secured. The cost needs to be contained and managed, and they need to be brought to end of life in a controlled fashion. So this sort of cradle-to-grave approach is what we're recommending here as a best practice. It's no longer just about device management, although device management is clearly key. It's about managing the whole life cycle. And if we break it down I'm sorry, was there a question there?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I wonder what with the introduction of, kind of the employee-owned devices into this, how it accelerates that cycle, because, as consumers, they might refresh much more frequently than a corporation might ever do it.
That's true, Joe, and it actually brings up that very important point we mentioned earlier about a best practice is to have a list of compliant devices, which are the only devices and platforms I should include, which are the only platforms and devices which the organization will support. In other words, it's not a best practice to say anything goes. It is a best practice to test and, if you will, publish the supported platforms for the organization so that employees who want to bring their device in know that they can only have their device supported if it's compliant with policy. And that's a big difference between best in class and all others. So that's one way to, if you will, to rein in that sort of churn of employee-owned devices, Joe, is to make sure they're compliant with policy. All right, so this is a bit of an eye chart. This next chart, I'm not going to read it to you, but I just wanted to share with you the reality that there's many stages, or to what we call, if you will, or many phases to these 6 stages. So just to give you a little bit of visibility, again, if you'd like to have more detail on this, I do encourage you to download the full benchmark report, which is available, and where you can learn more about each of these phases.
Andrew?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt again. Yeah, at the end of the webinar, folks, we'll let you know how you can get the full report. Sorry.
Okay, sure. It's just taking a while to paint for you guys. Forgive me, but such is the shared bandwidth of the internet at certain times of day. I'm sort of stalling for time here, Joe, because I would like them to see it.
Yeah, we're a little bit behind too. I'll tell you what, Andrew. There's a couple of questions that have come in while you've been speaking. You want to try to take one here while we wait?
Absolutely.
All right. So there's a question about whether Exchange Active Sync. The question, I guess, is this: we're using Exchange Active Sync to manage devices. What role can that play for you in an EMM environment?
Well, that's a good question. I'll try to. It has many aspects to it, but I'll try to sort of simplify. And you can let me know if you have follow-on questions. So Exchange Active Sync is really is an excellent way to get started. So Exchange Active Sync is supported by many mobile platforms, including iOS for the iPhone and the iPad, Android for both tablets and smartphones, and clearly, obviously, Microsoft platform as well as Symbian. I can see the chart just painted. That's good, and BlackBerry as well. The challenge with that, as the endpoint solution, if you will, is that Exchange Active Sync manages basically by, if you will, by mailbox identity. Now, if one only had one mobile device, having one mailbox assigned to one device would be perfectly logical, and it would make good sense. But many of us now have more than one device. For example, I carry a laptop on occasion, but I more typically have my smartphone with me at all times, and I also have a tablet. So there's actually 3 devices I have trying to access that one mailbox. So for the organization to try to manage my mobile infrastructure as if I'm a single entity, when in fact I'm 3 entities combined into one, is very limited in its ability to have insight and, if you will, power and control over my access. So I'll just suffice it to say that it's a good way to get started, but it's not a place to end up. Ultimately, there are better solutions on the market that are more comprehensive in their scope and that can manage the full life cycle, as you see here in this chart, so that ActiveSync by itself is not the complete solution. So I think I'll keep moving, Joe. If we could hold the next question until a little bit later. Thank you.
That's fine.
So this is actually, this next slide actually was an eye-opener for me, and I guess it might be, to be honest, a bit of a shock. What am I showing you here? Let me go backwards one click here. So what we're looking at here is comparing smartphone and tablet security. And you look across the bottom, I'm looking at several attributes which are quite basic in terms of data loss prevention, device management, and control. You see locking and wiping devices remotely, a virtual private network or VPN for mobile devices, two-factor user authentication, etc. And you look at the frequency of these capabilities being in place for best-in-class organizations. You can see that the best-in-class are much more likely to have these in place. Now, if I click to the next transition, and you see it paint the frequency for these capabilities among tablets, even among the best-in-class, they're lagging far behind. I mean, look at that first capability about locking and wiping devices. 80% of the best-in-class can do that for smartphones, but only 30% of the best-in-class can do that for tablets. That's a wake-up call. We already saw that almost 96% of organizations will have tablets in place of some form or fashion by the end of the year, but currently only 30% of them are being managed with the most basic device management. That tells us there's area for concern and improvement. So this is a real eye-opener for me and hopefully for you as well. This brings us to one of my key points, and Joe knows me, and I can get on a soapbox sometimes, so I'll try not to be too blatant about it, but this slide is designed to give you serious pause for concern if you've not already adopted enterprise mobility management in your organization. Let me explain to you what you're looking at here. This is what I call the Russian roulette of lost devices. Down the first column, you see approximately 12 or 13 statutes, laws or regulations that were chosen specifically with the intention of representing the broad spectrum of statutes that affect organizations that are both public and privately held, that are large, medium, and small in size, both North American as well as international presence. And if you look at the second column, you see the percentage of respondents who say that those statutes are relevant to them. And you notice there's not a single statute which is irrelevant to all. So what that tells us is that there are constituents here for whom each one of these statutes or regulations impacts their business. Now, the third column is you might say the killer here, the killer column. We asked the respondents to tell us what was the maximum financial risk or exposure to their organization from a single compliance lapse to that statute. And you can see at the low end, tax implications of mobile devices as listed property, and tax implications of employer reimbursement, which, by the way, impact most likely most every one of you on this call today. At the low end, a single compliance lapse is $10,600 on average. At the high end, for those who are in the retail industry or processing credit card information on mobile devices, a single compliance lapse can expose the organization to over $490,000 per incident. Now think of a single device that can have multiple instances of sensitive, private, or protected data fall into the wrong hands. There can be a multiplier on these numbers. So from $10,500 to $490,000, depending on your industry and your risk exposure, per incident and per lapse, I should say, and an incident could be multiple lapses. This should be a wake-up call that your organization cannot afford to, if you will, sort of stick their head in the sand and say that, well, we're getting great business benefits from mobility, and we really, we're not going to worry about this right now. Security, management, managing the full life cycle, that's for other organizations, maybe bigger, maybe smaller, maybe other regions. Well, I'm here to tell you that this is something that is of concern to all of us, and that a mobile device that is not secured and managed is one that is potentially a problem. So if you haven't already given serious consideration to enterprise mobility management, now is a great time to start, and hopefully this has been helpful in pointing that out to you. So I want to just keep moving. I'm sorry, Joe.
Yeah, I was going to say, Andrew, I know that this has nothing to do with mobility, but I'm sure Sony wishes they had done a few things differently right now.
I'm sure they do, and as many have who are accessing who have actually lost access to sensitive data. I wanted to show you the next slide, which, again, is taking a minute to paint. There we go. I wanted to talk about some emerging practices. This is one that we also noticed around cloud delivery of mobility management. And this is what we call an emerging service. If you look among best in class, at 19%, it's still relatively low, but it's over twice the rate of adoption of all other respondents. We're seeing this growing interest in cloud-hosted services among best-in-class organizations for both mobile device management, help desk, device support, and application support. So this has grown considerably over the last year. I believe last year around this time when we ran the study, it was running about 7 or 8% of the best-in-class were showing interest, and none of the others. It was really, not at their level of visibility. And now, basically, the rate of adoption is almost double what it was a year ago. Again, still embryonic, but we think pointing the way for the future and for the direction and the choices that the top performers are actually making. So I want to now move to concluding here. I want to talk about what some of the measurable results are. In other words, what is the business value that best-in-class actually did experience as a result of these practices we've been looking at? The first thing we wanted to look at was what was the one-year increase, or decrease for that matter, in help desk cost. And what you see here is that best-in-class organizations, their help desk costs increased by 1.3%. As compared to all others, that's 1/5 the increase over the prior 12 months that all others experienced. So how is it that best-in-class had lower help desk costs when they had higher penetration of secure mobility and all of these best practices we looked at earlier? They must be doing something right. There must be something about having properly trained support personnel and having the infrastructure in place is actually a way to decrease your costs over time. And clearly this chart is pointing us in that direction. Another business metric we looked at was the change in the time spent per help desk call. In this case, this is sort of inversely proportional. We're now looking for an improvement. What was the percentage improvement, if you will, or decrease in time spent per call? And you can see here the best-in-class improved their time spent per call by 6.7%. That is to say, 6.7% less time was spent per call over that year time frame, which is almost twice the improvement of all others. So not only did they decrease their costs, they also increased their efficiency. So they have accelerated, if you will, their ability to do more calls per worker, if you will, per work hour, I should say, or work hour equivalent. So they really have embodied some operational efficiency here through these practices, which is worth emulating. And this one is sort of the clincher here. So one might ask, is that because they're just spending a lot more money and throwing a lot more personnel at the problem? Maybe the best in class are best because they're spending a lot more money on personnel. Well, this tells us exactly the opposite is true. That, in fact, this is standing for IT, that is the information technology, FTE, or full-time employee equivalents. So this is the equivalent number of full-time employees that are assigned per 100 mobilized employees. You can see that on average, the best in class have 3 FTEs as compared to 13 of all others. So they have less than 1/4 of the full-time IT employees assigned to the same number of mobile employees as all other respondents. So if we needed, if we were at all dubious to this point, this should certainly be the clincher. There is something essential about efficiency of operations, of lowering support costs, of making IT more efficient and effective. And we looked before at how it lowers the risk of lost or stolen devices. Put all that together and it says there shouldn't be a whole lot of question about what to do. Just now, how do we get going? How do we begin? So
and they've also got more productive employees, right? Because their mobility penetration is so much higher.
That's correct. Absolutely correct. So I want to share with you, before I close, just some key takeaways, what we might consider to be recommendations about how mobility is becoming core IT. And I guess I want to just hit on that theme again because for many organizations, mobility was perhaps a business casual investment. It was a nice to have, not a need to have. And what we're noticing here is that among best-in-class organizations, that mobility is becoming core IT. and that consolidation under IT is essential. And we saw already how the best-in-class are driving down both cost and risk by managing the full mobile life cycle. That decreases support costs by 5 times, and it minimizes financial risk of compliance lapse. We also saw how the best-in-class are beginning to evaluate cloud services because they provide both fast deployment and low cost and scalability. So again, business reasons why cloud services delivery of enterprise mobility management is something that's being looked at. They're also betting on enterprise mobility management as a core strategy, whereas only 26% of laggard organizations can centrally manage their mobile devices over the air. This basic capability is at core to most EMM solutions and is a crucial step in establishing IT control. It's really by, the secret sauce here is by controlling access to corporate email. That's the, if you will, to use a vernacular, the gateway drug to mobility is having secure mobile access. And if IT says that you don't have secure mobile access to email unless you're compliant with policy and you allow us to enforce that on your own device, that is really the way that IT can get the upper hand, if you will, and reestablish their core role. So really, this is about putting IT back in charge. The best-in-class organizations have taken the lead and integrate their EMM efforts under IT service management principles. Just 30% of the industry average currently do this. So again, if you're not already consolidating mobility under IT, we highly recommend you do that. And lastly, don't forget the tablets. 70% of the best-in-class have deployed tablets without the most basic security measures in place, such as lock and wipe of lost or stolen devices. So, you know, we love tablets. They provide real business value, but they are essential core to be managed just as smartphones are and even tablets and the laptops are. And I might sort of conclude by saying that it's really essential that the entire mobile infrastructure be secured and managed. So it's not only smartphones and tablets, it's also laptops as well as netbooks. So everything mobile needs to be secure. And with that, Joe, I thank you for your time and your interest, and I'd like to hand the floor over to you if you could tell us a little bit more about what you'd like to say.
Yeah, I think back in mid-February, I think was the first time that I had actually seen some of your information. You were in the process of kind of finishing up the compilation, and you know, I was kind of fascinated by what you were finding then, and you know, the end results certainly every bit as fascinating. I am going to hang on a second here, Andrew. I'm going to take control back as the presenter right now. Folks, I know lots of people were sending me questions about getting the slides and getting the research. We are recording the webinar, and we will make it available as soon as we can get it up from WebEx and post it. So you'll see that soon. And right after the webinar, you should be getting an email that will give you a link that will allow you to get the full research. Andrew, are you able to see my slide now?
I'm getting there. Yeah,
okay,
we can
great.
see it now. Everything looks good. Thank you.
So, thanks. So, Andrew, thanks again. The research was great. I think it's really the most thorough and complete that I've read, and I read just about everything that comes out and gives folks lots of great detail and lots of really lots of actions they can take to actually get better, regardless of what category you find yourself in. So I just wanted to spend a couple minutes before we get to Q&A talking about FiberLink. So I'm sure most of the folks that are attending know us already. I won't bore you with the details. So we've been around for a while, over 20 years or 20 years. We make the MAD 360 platform. We work with all customers, all shapes and sizes. So you see a lot of big name logos here. But we, due to our cloud-based infrastructure, are able to scale down to work with companies of just about any size. And we've got over 1 million devices managed by the platform. That's mobile devices, laptops, smartphones, and tablets. So I think, to echo what Andrew had brought up in his research, really the issues are this. There's a lot of new devices out there, and I think, Andrew mentioned it now. There's, on average, about 4 platforms per enterprise that are being supported. So device diversity is increasing, and that's not going to change. Processes are lagging the choices, so I think, that the whole PACE model and, that big chart with all the EMM processes and sub-processes on it, I think is a good example of the fact that the process just hasn't caught up with where we all are. And then finally, the stakes are high, right? That's your Russian roulette slide right there, Andrew, right? So, these are the realities that everybody's faced with, and we're trying to find solutions for. So, of course, MAS 360, we believe, is the answer. Our main value proposition is one window, one system, right? So it's a single cloud-based infrastructure that you can use to manage your smartphones, Android, iOS devices, as well as Mac and Windows-based laptops. So you see the what we consider our 5 essential attributes: multi-platform. Since we're cloud-based, it's instantly available. You don't have to worry about any infrastructure or changing infrastructure since we're cloud-based. We think it's easy. We think it's fast. We think you'll think that too. This echoes really a lot of what Andrew had spoken about earlier and gives you just an example of some of the things you can do. So Andrew mentioned over-the-air configuration and enrollment, remote lock and wipe, persistent policy enforcement, enterprise application storefront. So these are all components of the MAS 360 platform that help companies that want to take that step into EMM and enjoy some of the benefits from a productivity perspective without necessarily incurring all the risks, that Russian roulette slide, and also will lower your costs in the long run, as the Aberdeen data pointed out. So I'll skip this one. So why MAS 360? Well, because we like to think that we have the best solution in the marketplace. So what I'll do before we jump over to Q&A is just give you the last follow-up here. So the full research report that Andrew's slides were based on is available. You'll get an email in a few minutes. It'll have a link where you can get the full research report. The webinar is being recorded. As soon as we can pull it from WebEx and get it posted, we'll post it at the Master Center. The email you'll get will also have a link to the webinar. Our next webinar is going to be on May 26th, and we're actually going to talk about enterprise app stores. So we're going to be talking about how companies are using app stores to deliver and manage enterprise mobile apps on tablets. And frankly, I think in some ways it may be the future for how all software ultimately gets distributed. I mean, it really is where I think consumerization meets software, right? Personal devices are where consumerization meets mobile devices. This seems to be where personal or consumerization meets software. So that's all I wanted to tell you, folks. You'll get the email in a couple minutes. I am going to jump back over now to the Q&A panel. You can use the chat panel also if you have some questions. We'll handle those right now. So Andrew, one here that I think is pretty relevant is asking what reasons you believe result in the disparity between the security of smartphones and tablets.
We thought a lot about that, because, as I mentioned, the research, the results that came back to us were a bit of a wake-up call for us as well. I believe it's most attributable. We do follow-up interviews with end users, and what we're finding is that it's sort of the tail chasing the dog kind of experience. In other words, it's not. No one in IT is saying that tablets are not essential and important to be secured, but the speed with which they've been adopted has just been so rapid that IT is just playing catch-up. The truth is that the tablets are no more difficult to manage and secure than smartphones are. So it's basically the same tools that are used to manage a smartphone could be used to manage a tablet. It's just they're playing catch-up. There's no other way to explain it, Joe. And one of the things that I think is worth mentioning is that if any of you are thinking that tablets are less likely to have sensitive information on them than smartphones, I would beg to disagree. We're finding that tablets are being used in a much more, if you will, in an integrated fashion in the enterprise with enterprise applications, with data center access, and with database access, and are therefore actually more likely to have sensitive information on them than smartphones per se. So I don't want to diminish the importance of smartphone security. I'm just going to reinforce the importance of tablet security, and that it really, I think, is job number one to get that, to bring up that 30% number back up to 70 or 80% of tablets being managed by best-in-class organizations. So.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the tablets are much more of an application platform than the smartphone, which is really kind of fundamentally a personal communication device.
Yeah.
Although it's certainly got more and more capabilities. Andrew, another question that came in was, do you have any data on how best-in-class versus others are actually managing their mobile devices? Do they use their own internally developed tools, or are they buying external tools from MDM vendors like FiberLink?
They are very few are developing their own tools. It's one of the reasons why we see sort of cloud services also having a growth trajectory. Let me explain the linkage that I have in mind here. Managing mobile devices for 99% of businesses is not a core competency, nor should it need to be. In other words, the mobility is a means to an end for almost every organization, not an end to itself. And so building up the skill sets internally or developing custom software for managing the devices really is not time or resources well spent. It's much better to leave it to the experts and allow the organization to focus on its core competencies. So with that in mind, I certainly, and we certainly do find in the results that widely available solutions that have a track record of proven by their reference accounts and their previous successes are having significant success. We see a lot of growth, healthy growth among the vendor community in EMM, and also, as I mentioned, for that same reason about letting the experts do what they do best, more and more organizations looking to cloud services.
Thanks, Andrew. There's one last question that I think we'll handle because we're running right up against our hour here. The question is really, can you define cloud services in regard to EMM? And I guess really the question here is one of that EMM model that you put up has quite a number of components. Things like FiberLink, as FiberLink's MAS 360 platform solve for parts of it, don't solve for other parts of it. And I guess the question is really, are cloud services available like across that spectrum, or are there things that you would absolutely have to have kind of the standard data center client server type architecture solution to perform?
Well, that's a good question. Probably warrants an answer that's more extensive than I can do in less than the minute left to us here. But let me give it a try. Granted, not all of the EMM stages are currently supported by cloud services. But I would say the most essential here that we talk about as being the core of EMM is that device management capability. So we're not saying to end there, but we're certainly saying to start there. And so having a managed service managed in the cloud. So those are two related aspects, but they are different. So a managed service would not necessarily be cloud-based, right? But a managed service is by a third party to manage the infrastructure. In other words, let the experts do what they do best. That's along that line of thinking. The cloud services relates to if you will, the technology infrastructure that managed services being provided through. And what's important there about cloud services is a number of things. One is the scalability, if you will, the low cost of adding additional endpoints, of adding additional capabilities and services, the fact that it's centrally administered across almost any endpoint platform. That central administration means that updates and upgrades are quite easy and efficient to deploy, and they're deployed almost ubiquitously, in other words, to all the devices at the same time. So it's a way to most centrally manage, to have it both be scalable. The solution needs to be designed to be for this type of architecture. It has to be what's called a multi-tenant architecture. That is to say that it really truly is scalable across, if you will, virtual servers. And again, this gets into a level of detail that we probably don't have enough time today. I do encourage those of you who'd like to discuss this further to get in contact with us via email. I'll be happy to continue this dialogue. And any of the questions that were not answered today, we will try to answer via email.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, we call our platform True SaaS because we are multi-tenant, and you know, kind of these days, there's all kinds of variations of architectures that get labeled cloud service. Yeah, I can tell you one thing, you know, just in terms of the one benefit that we see really clearly here. I mean, we're rolling out new features. I mean, you mentioned how quickly this market's evolving and changing, new devices, new form factors, new capabilities. I mean, we're rolling out a new feature elevation in our platform, you know, at least once a month. And I can't imagine an IT team that's got to, you know, manage that inside of their data center, trying to just keep up with the pace that's happening in this space right now. I mean, it's really something I think you need to think about because you know, things that didn't even exist a year ago are suddenly, you know, the platform you're going to deploy, you know, some key application, you know, 12 months later. It's really amazing. So it's, you know, we think it's a big advantage and is a big advantage for our customers. So Andrew, I apologize, we went a couple minutes over, but the data was great. The report's even more detailed. Thank you again, and folks, thank you for joining. I will get back to anyone who asked a question that we weren't able to answer here on the call. We'll get back to you as well. So thanks again for your interest in attending, and hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Andrew, thank you too.
You're welcome, Joe. Thank you, and thank you all for joining.